There's a specific type of person you've probably noticed. They're on social media, they scroll, they engage, they might even comment, but their profile photo is a landscape, a logo, or just the default gray silhouette. They never post selfies. No birthday photos, no vacation snapshots, no mirror pictures. They exist on these platforms almost like a ghost, present but invisible. Most people assume they know what this means. Shy, insecure, probably don't like how they look. Maybe they're hiding something. The assumptions come quickly and they feel intuitive, but psychology tells a more complicated story, one that reveals less about insecurity and more about how certain minds relate to identity, exposure, and the invisible cost of being seen. Because here's what's interesting. When researchers study social media behavior, they tend to focus on the people who post constantly, the oversharing, the performance, the curated highlight reel. But the people who deliberately stay off the visual grid, they're telling us something too, something that takes a little more unpacking. To understand this, you have to start with what happens in the brain when a photo gets posted and receives attention. When someone uploads an image of themselves and the likes begin to arrive, the brain's reward circuitry activates in a measurable way. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter tied to anticipation and reward, gets released. It's the same system involved in food, music, and social approval. The brain logs this as a positive event, and like most reward-based experiences, it creates a mild pull to repeat the behavior. This isn't a flaw, it's biology. Humans evolved as deeply social creatures. Being seen, recognized, and accepted by a group was once a survival mechanism. Social validation isn't shallow, it's ancient. So for many people, posting photos and receiving engagement feels genuinely good in a way that's neurologically real. But not everyone's brain responds to this loop in the same way, and that difference is worth paying attention to. Some people find the performance itself, the act of presenting a visual version of themselves for public evaluation, subtly uncomfortable in a way they can't always articulate. It's not necessarily that they fear rejection, it's something quieter, a kind of friction between the internal sense of self and the idea of that self being flattened into an image, broadcast outward, and left open to interpretation by dozens or hundreds of people at once. Psychologists refer to something called self-concept clarity, the degree to which a person has a stable, clear, and internally consistent sense of who they are. Research suggests that people with higher self-concept clarity tend to be less dependent on external feedback to feel grounded. They don't need the metric of likes to confirm their sense of self, because that confirmation is already happening internally. For these individuals, posting a photo isn't necessarily rewarding. It can actually feel unnecessary, even slightly destabilizing, because it introduces an external variable into something they've already resolved privately. This doesn't mean they're more evolved or less emotional, it simply suggests a different internal architecture, one where identity isn't organized around visibility. Then there's the concept of self-presentation, a term social psychologists use to describe the way people manage how they appear to others. Everyone does this to some degree, but people vary enormously in how much cognitive and emotional energy they invest in it. For some, crafting a digital image feels natural, even enjoyable. For others, it triggers a process that feels more like exposure than expression. There's a meaningful difference between wanting to share something and feeling pressured to perform. People who avoid posting photos often report, when asked directly, that it's not that they have nothing to show, it's that they have no interest in participating in the evaluation dynamic that the showing seems to invite. A 2017 study looking at social media behavior and psychological boundaries found that individuals who scored higher on certain measures of introversion and internal processing tended to view personal image sharing as a privacy boundary rather than a social opportunity. This wasn't about hiding, it was about a fundamentally different model of what personal information is for and who it belongs to. And this connects to something deeper about control. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain involved in decision-making, long-term thinking, and identity regulation, plays a significant role in how people manage self-disclosure. For individuals with a more deliberate, reflective processing style, the decision to share something about themselves is weighed against a different set of internal criteria. Not just, will this get a good response, but does sharing this align with how I actually understand myself? When those two questions produce conflicting answers, the default is often silence. There's also something to be said about the relationship between images and memory. A growing body of research suggests that photographing experiences can sometimes reduce the depth of memory encoding, a phenomenon sometimes called the photo-taking impairment effect. People who are less inclined to document their lives visually may, on some level, be protecting the experience itself, keeping it interior, not out of secrecy, but out of a preference for depth over documentation. The moment belongs to them in a way that a shared moment no longer fully does. Now, here's the part that tends to surprise people. In many cases, the people who never post their own photos are not less connected to others, they're often more selectively connected. Oxytocin, the neuropeptide associated with trust and bonding, is most strongly activated in contexts of genuine intimacy, direct interaction, shared vulnerability, close relationships. Broad social media visibility doesn't reliably trigger this system. What it triggers is a different kind of social sensation, one more tied to status and recognition than to actual closeness. People who opt out of the performance layer of social media may simply be running on a different social currency, one that requires fewer people but more depth. That doesn't make either approach superior, it simply maps on to different psychological needs, and neither set of needs is inherently more valid. What's worth noting, though, is that the assumption that non-posters are hiding something says as much about the culture as it does about the individual. We've arrived at a moment where digital visibility has become so normalized that its absence reads as suspicious. When someone isn't performing, the reflex is to ask why not, as if participation were the baseline and restraint required justification. That inversion is relatively new, and it's worth sitting with. The psychology of people who never post their photos isn't really about photos. It's about where people locate their sense of self, how they manage the boundary between private experience and public identity, and what they believe other people's eyes are actually for. Some people feel most real when they're witnessed. Others feel most real when they're not being watched at all. Both are coherent responses to being human in a world that increasingly conflates visibility with value. If you've never posted a photo of yourself online, this probably doesn't feel like a personality quirk to you. It probably just feels like how you are, like a preference that never needed much explaining, except that everyone around you seems to expect one. And that expectation itself is the most revealing thing in the room. Because the question was never really, why don't you post? The more interesting question is why we ever assumed everyone would want to. If this kind of psychological unpacking resonates with you, you'll likely find just as much to think about in the video on why some people feel deeply uncomfortable being photographed, even in private. It goes further into the identity and self-image research and connects to some unexpected places.